Welcome to this fringe event at the On Think Tanks conference. So first of all, thank you to Enrique, Louise, Andrea, and all of the On Think Tanks team for inviting us along today. It's been a great event so far. My name is Katie, and I'm Insights and Relationships Lead at Castle & Clay, and I'll be sharing this session with our panel here. For those of you not familiar with Castle & Clay, we're a communications consultancy helping public policy experts shape conversations that strengthen democracy. So really, we want to see people better engaged with the decisions and policies that affect their lives. And we believe that think tanks have a really key role to play here. So we've teamed up with some friends who you'll see on the stage for this session. We're currently waiting for Laura to join. Hopefully she will be able to join soon. I know she's having a bit of trouble with the platform. And they will introduce themselves as they have their time to speak. So we've titled this session, Partnerships for Change in a Complex World. And we're aware that a phrase like in a complex world is a little bit ubiquitous and perhaps implies that there's somehow a simple world that is possible, or that a simple world at one time existed. And we don't really think that that's the case. But really the aim of this title is to bring complexity into our awareness as we consider partnerships. If we're talking about partnerships for change, we really need to think about that change part too. And as many of us will know, change is complex. So to begin, my colleague Aidan, who's partner at Castle & Clay, will explore the question of how change happens and how think tanks can consider their role accordingly. And then we'll be handing over to Carla, Rachel, and hopefully Laura if she manages to join. So each of our panel members have what we would consider an exciting and intriguing approach to partnerships with complexity in mind. And they're here to provide some inspiration. And I think here Laura is now. So yeah, once Aidan is done, we'll be handing over to Carla, Rachel, and Laura. They'll provide some insight, and we'll be speaking for about approximately half of the session, and then we'll move more into a discussion. So if you think of any questions as you go, do share them in the chat, and we'll be able to bring them in as we get into the discussion. So for now, I will hand over to you, Aidan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. So thanks. So thanks for joining our session, and welcome, Laura. Well done for joining us. So over the years of asking the question to think tanks about why they exist, the answers have typically been along the lines of these three goals. Think tanks were born out of academia, and the desire to bring academic insight out into the public policy. And so, yes, of course, they value inquiry and research, but at the service of a specific purpose. And in short, think tanks exist to have an impact on society. So I know that this isn't necessarily there's some think tanks who are maybe a little bit more academic than others. So if you don't believe that think tanks are agents of change, then this session is probably not going to be for you. But if you do think that think tanks are agents of change, then let's talk about how change happens and why it's a reason for partnering. So I suspect that by virtue of everyone being here, that we're now all aware that it's not as straightforward as the hearts and minds approach, where we have this market of ideas in which the best ideas automatically rise to the top. So let's talk a little bit about other models of change. And before we move to the next slide, just a credit to our friends at Theos think tank in London, who last year did a bit of reflection on kind of models of change, and in doing that, basically saved us quite a lot of effort. So for more detail, you can have a look at the Breaking Ground kind of report by Nathan Ladin at Theos, in which they look at a few case studies and also explore the role of religion within that. But I wanted to look at three of those models of change, and there's, for anyone who studies this, you'll know that there are more, but these three in particular will help me hopefully illustrate my point. So the first one, which was put forward by James Davidson Hunter, basically rejected the hearts and minds approach, or the great man view of change, where a kind of charismatic leader brought about change. And instead, Hunter recognized that innovative ideas come from outside the immediate center, but are popularized through overlapping networks of elites. This is a model of change that I imagine many think tanks will recognize, but it's not the only one. For those who followed us for a while, you'll know that we talk about the shift from a bipolar dynamic to a tripolar dynamic, where the public, through social media, have become increasingly a dynamic actor in setting the agenda, where they were previously a passive actor. So the advent of social media, alongside the distrust of elites and mainstream media, and making other models of change more relevant. And let's have a look at a couple of those. So, for example, this model, which was put forward by Leslie Crutchfield. So this model suggests that successful social movements are neither anarchic nor leader-led. Instead, she argues they're leaderful and networked, and they pursue coalitions and alliances and other forms of collaborative engagement across sectors, across disciplines, across boundaries. And she highlights the importance of considering human beings as more than brains in a vat, as she calls them. Instead, they're creatures of story, they're creatures of emotion, and not simply kind of creatures of cognition and calculation. And so in this model, the normative power, for example, of art and media also come to the fore. And then like another model which is like relevant to us is this model of by Duncan Green. And so his focus on systems warns us against linear cause and effect thinking about change. And he argues systems are hugely complex, and as such, change is typically slow, but occasionally unexpected events lead us to critical junctures, and those who want to achieve change need to shift from thinking of themselves as architects of change to more like ecosystem gardeners, and they need to be ready to improvise. And power is undoubtedly a key agent, whether it's of change or inertia. Includes ideas of like hidden power, dominant narratives, cultural norms, etc. But those, like the last two models that we've talked about, are increasingly kind of relevant in our world. So why are we talking about this? What's the relevance to partnerships? Well, our focus as a company is to kind of pragmatically look at how we can navigate the new information environment in the networked age. So for us, there are three key takeaways to my mind. First of all, think tanks need to recognize that although elites remain important, strictly elite-led model of change is not enough. Secondly, policy isn't always the answer, and policy certainly doesn't exist in a vacuum. So if you're serious about achieving change, you need to either design policies that are compatible with the political environment, or you need to go upstream from that and change the political environment. And then connected to that, thirdly, think tanks can't do this on their own. This is too big of a bite for them to take. So a quick look at a few examples of recent headlines here show us that policy interventions which are aimed at policymakers are no longer the only game in town. And you might recognize a number of those from footballer Marcus Rashford around kind of free school meals, but also the Gilets jaunes in France, helping shape the agenda to some extent. And so basically beyond policy, partnerships can help to set the agenda. If you want to move to the next slide. So they can help to set the agenda. They can create a political environment which is more conducive to change, and they can get the change implemented. And so we picked our panelists like here precisely to help illustrate this. So, you know, Carla will talk about a bit more about this shortly, but E3G, for example, have rejected the idea of policy solutions that don't account for the politics of the situation, and instead they, as an organization, they've taken responsibility for creating the environment, which is conducive for change through alliances, through coalitions, an environment in which, like, the policy intervention can have the desired impact. So we'll be bringing Carla in a second. Rachel, Impact on Urban Health, has recognized that the issue of childhood obesity in London isn't a question of policy, or certainly not just a question of policy, but it's a question of the political environment within which decisions are made. She's built a network of organizations, from framing specialists to researchers to political campaigners to grassroots activists, to bring about change. And then Laura, just joined us at the OECD, recognized that corruption in Greece couldn't be tackled without engaging the younger generation about issues bigger than policy, which is about the political culture, for example. And she did this by partnering with social media influencers, to take the message beyond the OECD's typical audience. So, three hopefully very different takes on partnerships. And so, if we want to move to the next slide. Basically, as to sum up, partnerships can help by giving us a mandate for policy change among those it concerns. It can help us generate credibility, for example, legitimacy and reach. It can help us source powerful human stories. One of the barriers to storytelling that we always come across, from our friends in think tankers, are always like, oh, it's hard to find powerful human stories. Well, there are some organizations which can help you on this. Also creating coherence through leaderful alliances and consistent messages, and challenging what could be unhelpful narratives, I guess. So, for example, we know that think tanks have often struggled to connect with the public. This is not news to anyone here. And as we know, for example, from some polling that we did 2-3 years ago, when you ask the public who they trust to come up with ideas to improve the country, traditional sources of policy innovation generally struggle. So out on top of local community organizations, people like me and the like, and then institutions like think tanks lag well behind. And it's easy for us to snare at the notion of people like me, but we interpret this as a question of proximity and familiarity. The idea that I don't see myself represented by these groups and these institutions. I don't think they have my best interests at heart, which is also where partnerships come in. They can help us reach audiences that may not listen to us because they don't feel we represent them, and make a connection. So, just to kind of finish off on this, which partners are we talking about? Well, this is an appeal from us to think about partnerships beyond the usual suspects. So, other think tanks, of course, yes, NGOs for sure, but also grassroots movements, social movements. There's a session, I think, tomorrow about this, which I'm really looking forward to. Local community organizations, but also influencers and storytellers, and we'll hear more about those. And you might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable about this, and you're certainly not alone in this. So these are the usual reasons we hear from the fact that we engage with policymakers. Policy works from the top down, to wanting the credit to for a particular activation to generate more funding, concern around losing control over the message is often a big question, and also just generally this is not the kind of thing that think tanks do. So yeah, I would this is an appeal to kind of to break beyond those psychological barriers and to reconsider the question that we asked earlier, what is the purpose of think tanks? What is the purpose of your organization? And if you were to redesign it from scratch today, what would that look like? So I'm going to hand over to Katie at this point to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Aidan. Thanks for muting yourself. I'm just getting a bit of an echo. Yeah, so Aidan's already given a quite good outline of why we asked our speakers to come and speak. So I won't go into too much detail here, and they can obviously present for themselves as well. But we're going to start with Carla from E3G, move through to talk to Rachel at Impact on Urban Health, and then Laura will talk more about her partnership with YouTubers. Carla, I will keep control for your slides and just give me a cue when you want me to switch over. That's all good. And just to say as well, if you have any burning questions for Aidan on anything he just presented, feel free to drop them into the chat and we will pick them up when we get into discussion. Carla, over to you.
Thanks, Katie and Aidan, and hi, everyone. I am really pleased to be here and to join this conversation. I think I can probably use E3G as a think tank that can dispel the idea that think tanks can't do coalitions, if there is anyone who still has that view. I am an associate director at E3G. We are a climate politics think tank. I am also part of the secretariat team for London Climate Action Week. I have a background in strategic change. I've worked as a lawyer and in pretty much all sectors, but I've spent most of my career in the nonprofit world. And so that's, really driving strategic change is what is sort of I'm steeped in, I suppose, and really keen today to share some of the insights and sort of position E3G's thinking around coalitions in our wider strategic change model. Thanks, Katie. If we can just go to the next slide. So E3G's goal is climate safety for all. We make the necessary possible, and I think E3G was founded in 2004 as third generation environmentalism, really with the goal of turning environmental knowledge, awareness and understanding into practical political solutions that can be implemented. E3G, over the time that it's been established, has been recognised as one of the top environmental think tanks in the world. Just to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where coalitions sit within our change model. Most think tanks, NGOs have really our resources and our size is always going to be relatively small compared to the scale of the problem or the ambition of our vision. And take E3G, climate safety for all. So you don't need to be a climate scientist. You just need to be acquainted with the news to know that is quite a big mission. So for us, who we work with is as important as when we choose to act and as critical as what we say. So the model that's on the screen here, we call it leverage cubed, or to the power of 3. And so the first step that we can take to really increase the reach that we have with our small resources is to work with partners and allies. So coalition building for us is really embedded in our strategic change model. The other thing that we do is also focus on the most strategic outcomes that we can conceive that will have the highest impact in terms of the political, institutional, economic leverage that they will deliver. And I think those two things partnered together are really key to what we do. Just perhaps to mention, I'll try and bring in a few examples. The one here, I think, that really shows the leverage is the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is a coalition of progressive countries and subnational actors focused on transitioning beyond coal, one of the most highly polluting and dirty sources of energy that we have in the world. It was launched It was kind of catalysed by E3G and launched by the governments of Canada and the UK. And in terms of kind of high leverage and a high impact, the power that governments have is also really key, but they can also be work. So one of the ways we work is working with progressive countries and actors to get them to organise and to go further. Next slide, please. So when is a coalition needed? At E3G, we think about, as I said, the strategic outcome, and we map really closely the politics that will, who are the agents, who are the allies that we can work with, and who has agency and the ability to influence the strategic outcome that you are seeking to achieve. And we do that before we think about what kind of coalition we might need and what that might look like. The example that I would mention here is the Green Investment Bank, which was an initiative that E3G conceived after the last financial crisis, the 2008, the one that was the big one before all of our current crises, which are now the big ones in the complex world, Katie, that we live in. E3G wanted to think about how do we green infrastructure investment and how do we build green and low carbon into the recovery. And that was the strategic outcome that we wanted to achieve. And we then designed a coalition around that became known as Transform UK and included, that was really a cross-sectoral coalition. So it was about organising different actors from different fields and bringing them together. So we had finance and business and NGOs working together towards this common goal. So that's the example there. I think there are different strategic problems and strategic outcomes have different needs for coalitions. So in that instance, the actors in that space were not well organised and there were gaps in the way that the institutions were working. So there was kind of a job to be done in terms of organising those voices and creating a more unified, joined up approach to the whole problem. And in that instance, that coalition and that initiative was successful in securing the creation of a new Green Investment Bank in the UK at that time. Next slide, please. The other element that I just wanted to touch on is what we call the policy funnel and the time factor in how we think about change and where to position coalitions in that context. And I think, I mean, it would be interesting for those in the room to consider, as a think tank, where do you spend most of your time? So some organizations tend to focus on the far right-hand side, the final decision, the policy side. Some organizations tend to spend a lot more time at the research end of the spectrum. And I think what we've done at E3G is to think about, well, how do we get from one to the other? And what we see is that as, and hence it's called a funnel, that as we move from the research, general opinion concepts through to a public debate about a specific issue and into a policy process, that the options space narrows and the role of your stakeholders, your think tank, your coalition really changes. The example that I wanted to mention here was a coalition called Greener UK. It was established after the vote in the UK to leave the European Union, which really put on the line all environmental legislation and protections in the UK, given that about 80% of that was at the time coming from the EU. And this was an NGO coalition, and this was a really kind of unprecedented coming together of about 13 big environmental organisations in the UK around this challenge. And I think the formation of that really came in that public debate section. And I think in terms of the public debate and the political debate, that coalition did a very good job of uniting, of saying that the public, and there were big membership organisations in that group, didn't want the environment to be, sort of sacrificed in the UK's departure from the EU, and that environment was really a cross-party issue. So that coalition did a lot of work, but I think it was really crucial in that part of the debate, and then through to, and it probably went through a few cycles through to final decision on various different points. Next slide, please, Katie. So those examples that I've mentioned sit for E3G alongside quite a large number of different coalitions that we've been part of or that we've been involved in setting up. They have these, very different, they each have their kind of own culture and purpose and time and place. I've mentioned a number, and also the composition is really different, and the E3G role. So I think there's a lot of really rich things to think about there. The ones I've mentioned, working with progressive governments, working with a cross-sectoral kind of multi-stakeholder coalition, or working to align NGO advocacy activity are sort of some of the exemplars. There are others as well. The final slide, Katie, is a bit of a kind of an open for the discussion, really, which is climate change is really a whole of society action and a whole of society problem. We need change sort of everywhere, every country, every sector. And one of the other things that E3G has done in the last few years is set up London Climate Action Week, and that is really about harnessing the connectivity of London for global climate action. So in a sense, it's not a coalition in a conventional sense, but it very much involves creating space, creating a platform for a kind of festival of ideas and for different stakeholders to come together. And also it has, I think, real potential for reach to the public and for public access to and participation in different conversations around how do we grapple with these increasingly challenging issues, but also how do we take the concern that people have about climate change and other issues and turn it into real action and create something where everyone can be part of the change, and also hold power to account. I think both those dimensions are really key. I'll leave it there, and thanks very much, Katie and Aidan, and I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel and the discussion.
Thank you, Carla. That was great. It was fascinating. I have so many questions, so I'll have to try and rally how many I share at the end. Yeah, over to you, Rachel. Rachel's going to share a little bit more about how impact and urban health work across kind of multiple agents at multiple levels around the change required. Rachel, I have your slides, if that's good for you.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, thanks, Katie and Aidan, and also Carla. That was really, really interesting. Lots of stuff that I would love to speak about you with after. So I'm Rachel Pigeon. I'm a portfolio manager at Impact on Urban Health, and I lead a lot of our work around campaigning and advocacy and amplifying voices and reframing and shaping public narratives. So the places that we grow up and live and work impact how healthy we are. And urban areas like inner city London have a really amazing vibrancy and diversity right alongside really stark inequalities. And at Impact on Urban Health, we want to change this. So we're a funder, and we're focused on improving health in urban areas. We address health inequalities by focusing on a couple of really complex health issues that disproportionately impact people living in cities. At the moment, that's 4 programs on childhood obesity, multiple long-term conditions, the health effects of air pollution, and children's mental health. And our programs are long-term, they're at least 10 years, and they're formed of partnerships at a really local level, kind of borough level within cities, a city level, a national level, and also at an international scale sometimes. And I think to kind of put in context where I'll go with the rest of the presentation, a lot of think tank work is obviously really grounded in the political, and starts by sometimes thinking about policy environments and actors. As a funder, we first focus on what could work, so where the evidence shows us we can have an impact on a health issue, and then layering up multiple initiatives with multiple partners who can help us approach the issue from different angles. And one of those angles will be policy and influencing, but there might be other angles as well. So if we could move to the next slide, Katie. One example of this is our childhood obesity program. So if we're thinking about children's health, we support partners to change the environment where children and families access food. So in the homes and early years, in schools and in streets. And we back partners ranging from hyper-local community food organizations, so local pantries in different neighborhoods, fresh fruit and veg vouchers for families on low incomes, through to projects at a national and international scale with retailers and manufacturers, testing shifting environments in big supermarkets like Tesco and Sainsbury's with the Consumer Goods Forum, things like backing new innovative food ventures through our Good Food Fund, who are developing a portfolio of healthier snack brands that can kind of challenge the market, and also working with chefs and catering companies to improve food culture and provision in schools. So we don't have one view or model of how change happens, but we do believe in an approach of building out and not down. So one example that I could pull out from our work in childhood obesity and children's health is around framing and public perception. So that's something that cuts across the whole of the program, across all of the strands. We saw that the public discourse around childhood obesity is really unhelpfully framed. It's out of step with the evidence, and that's led to policymaking that's focused on individual decision-making rather than creating healthier food environments. And we've just seen this in the UK with some of the news stories and policy decisions around restricting junk food advertising to children and price promotions on really unhealthy products. So all of this creates a barrier for our ability to influence. It creates a barrier for our ability to scale and replicate some of the solutions that we see work locally beyond our program. And so we want to reframe the conversation around children's health so that policy is targeted more at changing environments and circumstances and not individual behavior. So in part, this means changing communications around childhood obesity, especially from really influential voices and organizations, which again is kind of guiding who we partner with in that space and how. The next one, Katie, thanks. So just to close, everything that we do as a funder is in partnership. We often work to amplify both the success that we've had in our programs, but also slightly more leaning towards supporting organizations to have an impact on a particular health issue, and then providing resource and funding for them to be doing their own kind of influencing and partnerships beyond just what we funded them to do as well. So we choose our partners based on who can have an impact on an issue. Often that includes beginning with thinking about what people's real lives look like, doing some community research, working with local grassroots groups, including new voices and young people. And then that is kind of complemented by some of the work that we do that's at a slightly larger scale and slightly more high profile sometimes. And as a funder and a foundation, we won't ever be a name with a big political profile. So we do a little bit of direct policy work. And we do sometimes also partner with think tanks for that credibility and their expertise and ability to challenge us in our thinking. But yeah, we very much are supporting our partners to do that. And broadly, equally, when we are thinking about our approach to influencing, we do what we can to amplify lived experiences of people who are most impacted by health inequalities that we work on. And also just to say, we use influencing very broadly because we want to encompass a range of decision makers. So sometimes that's policymakers, but often that's businesses. So in our work in air pollution, for example, a lot of what we're doing is working with the construction industry and freight and businesses to reduce their impact on poor air quality. So that's just a note. And yeah, broadly, just to close, we support partners to do their own influencing work. We catalyze groups of action around specific issues. So, you know, kind of similar to some of what you were talking about, Carla, but maybe at a different scale sometimes. We've brought together a group of organizations and individuals in the school food space to collaborate on policy and campaigning. So to be sharing research, to be sharing successes, and to be coordinated around media and policy approaches. And then we share evidence from our programs and what works in London with other places, other urban areas. And that's our kind of theory of change, of how we have an impact beyond South London, where we primarily work to a larger scale. So hopefully that's a helpful, very brief overview of the broad stuff that we do, and looking forward to questions as well.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's really fascinating to hear, especially when you touched upon the unhealthy or unhelpful rather kind of view or understanding that maybe politicians and the public have around causes of health inequality and issues like obesity, and how, you know, with all the goodwill in the world, your research and influencing might show that actually, you know, obesity is caused by systemic problems rather than it being an individual issue. But if both this gets into kind of Aidan's tripolar policy dynamic that he presented around, if something doesn't feel politically viable for a politician because the public doesn't see it that way, or the politicians themselves don't have that systemic understanding, that there's this kind of, they get quite stuck in this dynamic and discourse around a topic that you're really working on shifting that frame so that all of the policy recommendations that speak to more systemic issues are viable because people's understanding of the issue has shifted. So it's really fascinating. I think that links really nicely into Laura's, what Laura will discuss, which is around trying to get the public more engaged in some of these issues so that you're almost creating a fertile ground and kind of changing understanding or engaging more people on these topics. So I will hand over to Laura. Go ahead. I think you're on mute. Are you able to Okay, looks like Laura is really struggling there. Laura, I don't know if you had any notes or anything from your talk that maybe you could share in the chat, or I could grab them in from if you email them over to me, I can grab them into the chat just so that people have a bit of an understanding about what you were going to talk about. Sorry that you've had such trouble with this platform. Yeah, well, how about we move into questions and we'll see if we can share any insights. Aidan, you look like...
Yeah, like I'm somewhat familiar with the case study, so like let me kind of like say a few words, like at least and
yeah, Laura, if Aidan's going telling the story.
And Laura, please feel free to contradict anything I say in the chat. Hello, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I've got you.
Cool. So basically is Aidan frozen for everyone else, or is that just me? Okay, hold on a second. I'll just put a note. Okay, while we're waiting for Aidan to come back and hopefully to be able to present that, I just wanted to ask to maybe Carla, you could touch on the comment that Enrique has put into the chat about how complex it must be to manage a number of partnerships over a number of projects and streams, and it's actually sort of a question I was going to bring to the whole panel, which was one of the barriers as well that wasn't mentioned on Aidan's slides was that people may have around partnerships and coalitions is
it's so much hard work. There's so many people to corral, and what you would have to say sort of on that topic in response. And Aidan will pick up with you after that question.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Enrique, for the question. Yeah, it's not. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's for E3G, it's very much built into the way that we work. So I was thinking a little bit about this and preparing. It's very much embedded in our change model, but then it flows through into the way that we do strategy, the way we do resource allocation, and the way we design our roles. So it's very much, but at the same time, I think you clearly have to pick the right coalition for the right moment, and it is in itself a strategic intervention, and you do need the right level of resources to do it. And it's quite an investment of organizational and also personal, kind of capital and reputational capital to do it, and a certain skill set. We do also do some training on coalition building and share that with some of our partners, because we see it as so critical to the skill set that's required to achieve the change that we want to see. But the other thing, you're also absolutely right that if you're working on a number of different areas, you then also have to coordinate not only yourselves, but also internally on these different things, but then also, the coalitions that you're working on. And again, for E3G, it's sort of wired into the way we work that it goes to the point that the resources that we will ever have as an organization will always be smaller than the scale of the problem. And so what we can do is we can't be, a civil service, but we can do the dot connecting and the political and policy connecting that the people in those big organizations that we need to move are not able to do. So that, again, that way of working is quite wired into us. But I'm not going to say that it doesn't take resources or skills or thought. And I think that's really critical to think also for organizations, what is your capacity for change and to see what could work in a particular instance, and how can you, if you wanted to experiment or to partner with someone who's more used to the way of working.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, and I think it's fascinating on the point around it taking lots of resource, but then sort of thinking in a much of a long-term way around. I was actually speaking to someone who was involved in the Greener UK Alliance that you mentioned around, and we were just talking generally about this idea that, yes, it is a lot of work, but that when you're working, where there are multiple organizations working on the same issue, but maybe have slightly nuanced messages, or sometimes disagree with each other on, on certain elements or the way to tackle something, can mean that sometimes, though you have generally the same end goal, that you're sometimes working slightly against each other, or there are a lot of voices clamoring for kind of to be heard, and actually really that speaking with one voice and getting together to make the big things happen takes work, but is also in some ways more efficient in the long run, rather than kind of working in isolation and trying to push things forward.
I think that's right.
We seem to have lost Rachel now, so I can't send the question to her, but here she is.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I wondered if you could speak to this kind of question around how to make about kind of working with partners, multiple partnerships and coalitions maybe being quite complex, and in a way sort of this kind of intimidating question of how do you corral everyone and how do you manage that, and whether you could speak to your experience of the sometimes complex parts of working in partnership.
Yeah, I guess because we are coming at issues from so many different perspectives, that complexity has kind of always been part of the way that we work, I guess. Some things I would say I've noticed that impact on urban health is what I talked about in my presentation a little bit, of having a really clear sort of why question and what we want to get to, but being really open about how, and being more focused on finding the right partners to help us learn about an issue means we have quite a lot of flexibility when it comes to that. So we're really lucky as an organization, and probably part of that comes from being a funder. Our programs always have a year or two develop phase where we're kind of testing and learning things. The net is cast fairly widely, and then we're kind of narrowing down to probably a slightly smaller number of partners who we've identified can really help us have an impact, and maybe a smaller number of focus areas, and longer term partnerships that are more about kind of core funding, sometimes really backing an organization that has kind of shown us that they're creating change. So for us, I guess it's slightly different in that it's often our partners who would be leading then coalitions to be creating an impact. And for us, the important part is finding those partners and then building enough trust with them to be able to say, okay, now, we're gonna really back you. This looks like long-term funding. This looks like core funding. This looks like flexibility. We're really aligned on our strategy, and then kind of letting them get going from there. It's then our role internally at Impact on Urban Health to be spotting for like co-benefits across programs, opportunities to connect them with other people, other partners that we have, that kind of thing. So a slightly different context for us, but hopefully some of those principles are helpful. I'm interested in if people have challenges or anything to any of that as well.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. I'm really sorry, Laura, that you were unable to join. We were really looking forward to hearing from you, but perhaps Aidan can kind of speak a little bit to the work that you were doing. And let's just try you one more time. See if maybe fifth time's a charm. It doesn't look like I have the power to unmute you. I'm sorry about that, but it's nice to have you on stage while Aidan presents. Yeah, Aidan, over to you.
All right, let me try again. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I think I'm only saying that this came from like a piece of work that the OECD was doing with with Greece around the issue of corruption and bribery, and one of the goals of the program was to tackle the issue in Greece, and one of the reasons why we loved this case study was that rather than taking an approach of let's do some more research, or let's develop a report, or whatever, the approach was, well, how can we actually start a conversation in Greece around this, and in particular, how can we start a conversation with young people to try and shape the political culture and the political environment around the issue of corruption, because otherwise interventions won't necessarily there's no point in policy interventions around corruption if the political environment isn't conducive to this. And so as a result of this, I think I'm right in saying the OECD engaged four pretty high profile YouTubers in Greece to basically collaborate with them on on videos which tackled the issue of corruption, but crucially allowed them to talk about it in their own terms, in terms that they could relate to, in terms which could relate to to their audiences. And so I from talking about this a number of times with Laura, I understand that one of the one of the key worries at the time was, well, how do we control the message, if we're handing over editorial control to those YouTubers. And I don't know if Laura, maybe you can talk to that a little bit more in the chat, and post about how you kind of allowed for how you mitigated for for that loss of control. But but basically, like, what came out of this were four different YouTube videos, which I think altogether as a whole generated like was it 3 million views or something along those lines, in the millions, like anyway, which like for a video like about for an OECD kind of like a topic area was unheard of. Generated 62,000 engagements, like and actually won the OECD a social media award in Greece. And so like the reason that we kind of like loved this example was because this is a different type of partnership. It's a partnership with like we talk about like media partnerships. This is a partnership like with social media influencers, and why wouldn't we? To try and like bring home conversations around issues that matter to society, but in terms which people can actually identify with. So I don't know whether I've like how good a job I've done of like translated that, Laura. But yeah, like if you've got any like questions about this, like please like add them in the chat, and I'm sure Laura would be happy to either answer them or like we can circle back to with you afterwards.
Thank you, Aidan, for picking that up without preparation. Very impressive. Clearly familiar with the project. I think it's a really nice example, as well as if we know that young people and young creators as well are socially engaged and politically engaged, and will be talking about topics anyway. So if think tanks can play a role in sort of arming them with a certain level of information and background research as well, to kind of create a dialogue even better. I think I know that with Laura. Oh, have you managed to unmute Laura?
Have I?
You've done it. Magic. Is there anything?
Who knows how? I'm going to stop touching things.
Is there anything you wanted to pick up on?
No, well, thank you very much, Aidan, for just jumping on that and doing a great presentation.
Oh, you've gone. There was a moment where we could let you in. It looks as though there are a couple of people who may want to join on stage to ask questions. I think Diego, if you're trying to join, I'm going to let you join the stage. If not, just drop a note in the chat and say that it was an accident. But yeah, it'd be great to have a few people on stage asking questions. So I will let Diego on first.
Have we lost Katie? We're doing very well on the tech today.
Tricky.
Well, while we wait for Katie potentially to rejoin, and I know we've only got a few minutes left, but Carla, I had a very quick question for you. It's like when you're thinking about the coalitions that you pulled together, how do you identify members of the coalition? What kind of criteria do you have in mind?
Great question. Thanks, Aidan. Well, how long have you got? Because as you can see, there's quite a few. I would say that there's some principles, but I don't think there's one size that fits all. And I think there's a range of things that need to play into that. But I guess there's the strategic factors around, who might have the agency or the ability to influence, right? Or how do you go beyond what you're able to do as an organization? And sometimes it's also about legitimacy, who can really be able to speak to the issue that you're talking about. And for environmental focused organizations, for example, if you need to speak about economics or finance or infrastructure decisions, then you need to be able to work with people who can be part of that conversation. you need to think, you might need to think about workers and unions and who can speak about those aspects. So I think that comes into it as well. And then I think there is a kind of it is an element of who is the coalition of the willing and who can you really work with. Because I think the relationship's also clearly an important part of it, and being able to have people who you can align with and you can come alongside and you can really have some effective working relationships, even if you don't always agree on everything, that you'll be able to achieve some outcomes together is really important as well.
Right, thank you. There's a follow-up, like a question from Andrea, which is, with all the different voices in a coalition, how do you manage how it's organized, and how are all the different interests managed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is a serious endeavor, right, to kind of be talking about large multi-stakeholder coalitions and managing all those competing voices. I think if you are the organizer of the coalition, I think that how you set it up and then how you run it is really important to be able to then create something that is manageable. And in that sense, a coalition is not that different from any other ways of working that we might have to grapple with inside our own organizations as well as with coalitions. But I think, having the basics right in terms of the agendas and so on, it does also give you a certain, if you've got the clarity of purpose, and then if you're also the one that's organizing things, it does also give you a level of influence and in some instances control to be able to ensure that the coalition can keep moving forwards and having momentum. I mean, I've certainly seen coalitions where that can be more or less successful, but when you really do unite different organizations with different things that they can bring around a common objective, it can also be incredibly powerful, and you can go more quickly than what you might have anticipated.
Thanks for picking up, Aidan. And I'm sorry for dropping off there. Yeah, well done for Carla and Rachel for managing to stay on stage for the whole time. I don't know how you managed to do that. We are at time there, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to cover everything and we didn't get to hear from Laura. But thank you so much for joining us, Rachel, Carla, and Laura, for trying so hard to come and speak with us. Really lovely to chat. Okay, we are allowed a couple of more minutes. I don't know, Carla and Rachel, if you're happy to stay on. I think the one thing that I wanted to touch on really, and that I put into the chat, which was that one of the things that it would have been really nice to discuss with Laura was that while the direct partnership that she was talking about was that was partnering directly with YouTubers, that they were also kind of thinking about partnering with the public, because it was kind of trying to have this public discourse. Carla, you've touched on that with London Climate Action Week, and Rachel too, with your work. And I wonder if you think that's a useful frame for think tanks, and how much that kind of is an active discussion for you, or whether it sort of only comes up when you feel that there's sort of a job to be done with sort of public awareness or public opinion on a topic.
I don't mind kicking off briefly. So for us, it's absolutely vital because we're working on issues that really deeply impact people's lives. So when we're forming what are, when we were thinking about what health issues are we going to focus on, finding a way to listen to and speak to residents in Lambeth and Southwark, the two boroughs in South London where we're based, was vital. So we saw, okay, we have to look at the evidence around childhood obesity. We have to understand large data sets, but also we have to look at people's experiences. So although we as a foundation aren't necessarily we aren't well connected with residents, we work with people who are really intentionally for that purpose, because it's absolutely essential to bigger decisions around where we're putting money, where we're focusing on having an impact, because ultimately we aren't just looking at a specific policy change or something like that. A lot of the time we're looking at kind of incremental shifts in inequalities and in people's quality of life at the end of the day.
And presumably this is what that kind of connection with the public is what gives you the mandate, like, to actually kind of do this.
I think so. And it's something that, we see as a real strength. So being able to take some of what we learn in a particular place and amplify that and share that with others, and some of those really deep insights around what does it actually look like when you have a £20 food budget, for example. How healthy can you actually be? Following people in shops, doing ethnographic research, that kind of stuff has really helped us crystallize what our strategy is, and give us and others confidence in then what we're advocating for.
Carla, any final thoughts on that?
I'm just aware that it's a huge conversation and we've got really limited time. I think clearly there is a question for kind of this issue of really kind of going beyond kind of elite influencing, given the kind of the rise of social media, both for good and for bad in terms of public engagement. And then I think there is, really interesting thinking around how new narratives and ways of working can emerge. And I would love to pick up that, Rachel, and maybe in the London Climate Action Week context, we really want to bring health voices in there. So I think, and that connectivity between these different complex issues that we're grappling with and how we bring people together to do that is a huge challenge, but clearly it's also a huge opportunity, because I think it's more subtle, but I think then feels maybe like going to Westminster, but actually the change that you can create could actually ultimately be more transformational.
Great, thanks so much. I'm aware we're over time, so I will let you go, but thank you so much, Carla and Rachel, for taking the time to join us. And Laura, if you're still on, thank you for sharing, and Aidan too for your piece on how change happens. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much to those who joined, and good to see you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.